Hello everybody, welcome to the NQA OHSAS 18001 migration to ISO 45001 webinar. I hope you're all well. My name's Terry Fisher. We expect the webinar to last up to 45 minutes, up to an hour. If you've got any questions, by all means type in the questions as we go. We won't be answering questions as we go, we'll do that at the end of the session. So, firstly, if we just talk about the content of today's webinar, the structure of the standard will be covered, the key concepts of ISO 45001, new terminology and important definitions, main differences between OHSAS 18001 and ISO 45001, the migration timeline, and practical tips on preparing for the changes. If you do have a question, as I say, don't wait for the question and answer session. By all means, record your questions in the box to the right of your screen. Type that in there, and where we can, if we get several questions on a particular theme, we'll try and address those at the end of the session. One of the first questions could be, why would you want to implement 45001 if you haven't already got an occupational health and safety management system? Well, primarily the systems are designed, both systems, both 18000 and 45001, are designed to improve performance in a structured and formatted way. With 45001, the primary thing is you may want to drive cultural change to improve that performance based on risk-based thinking and worker engagement. We want to be proactive, looking at risk management, systematic approach, reduce culpability, and help protect the workforce and your workers. Proven commitment through leadership, action, delivering improvement. That's the basic fundamentals of why we're looking at the occupational health and safety management systems. We'll now look briefly at the structure of the draft 45001. It follows the same structure to the recently revised 9001 and 14001 high-level structure of Annex SL. Some of you may well be familiar with that structure now. It's basically broken down into 10 elements, starting with the scope. That's the intended benefits of having the ISO management system, the normative references, the terms of references used within the particular standard, context of the organisation, which I know a lot of people have had questions about, leadership, planning, support, operation, performance evaluation, and improvement. This is a common high-level structure now used to all newly revised management system ISO standards, and as I've previously mentioned, has already been implemented against 9001 2015 and ISO 14001, which is the environmental standard 2015 version. So to a great extent there has been some standardization of the standards. We're trying to use a common high-level structure with identical core text, and common terms and core definitions. One of the things I would like to introduce at this point, before we get heavily into the presentation, if you have any questions, by all means raise them, but take some time during the presentation to think about what principles you don't understand, how will you take ownership of the management system and make it yours, and what occupational health and safety management system challenges may you have or you may encounter going forward. This may help you think about the issues that you may find or encounter should you be considering the implementation of this or the transition from the existing. So here we have the key concepts. If we think about the ISO management systems, if we look at them as management systems under the ISO umbrella, yes, there are various types, but they're all following the same high-level structure of Annex SL. And all these management systems should be viewed as business enhancement techniques. They should be delivering benefit to your business or your operation. That's the primary fundamental requirement of all these things. It's not trying to give additional burden in administration or additional layers to your company structure. It's there to deliver benefit and improve performance. Obviously there is a family of these currently, ISO 9001, which is the quality management system, ISO 14001, which is the environmental management system, the draft ISO 45001, which is the occupational health and safety management system, and ISO 27001, which is your IT security structured system. All the models that we talk about today all follow the same PDCA model. This is being reinforced with the 10 elements of the standard. The first 3 are about the structure of the standard itself, and then from 4 to 10 are the actual operational requirements that we'll be talking our way through. Firstly, if we think about the context of the organisation, what we're trying to define here is basically what are the requirements put up on your organisation both internally and externally, depending on what you do. So you need to think about what you do and how that can impact on your occupational health and safety system, and the needs and expectations of relevant interested parties. Now these can range from visitors, employees, shareholders, a whole spectrum of relevant interested parties, and they will be unique to your particular organisation and operation. This is what we're trying to identify. Only when we've looked at all these various things can we then define the scope of the management system that you wish to apply to your organisation. We're looking to enhance performance by following the Plan, Do, Check, Act formula and the 10 elements of the standard. we're looking to enhance performance, protect people. Particularly strong in this particular standard is engagement with workers and the participation of workers in the management system. This is a key emphasis within the revised standard. It's always been there within the existing 18,001, but it's really strongly emphasised going forward. We want to improve culture so that people think safely, naturally, and operate in a safe way without unnecessary burdens of procedures and restrictive practices. Everything has got to be based on a balanced approach to risk. We want to fulfill and satisfy the requirements and expectations of those relevant interested parties, which includes the organisation itself. So obviously, in real terms, what this means is, yes, you're running a business or an operation. There may well be commercial considerations to that. But the fundamental well-being of one of the potentially the biggest asset, the people within your organisation, has got to be at the core of what you do. That health and safety culture needs to be embedded within the organisation. So this is why the term leadership has been introduced as opposed to management, because all those things will require leadership, not just the management of I've allocated a certain amount of resource or I've allocated a certain person to look after that. Yes, that may be an element of it, but there will be direction, strategic decision making that is fundamental to the successful implementation and operation of the management system. I think it's really important that one of the things the revision to the Annex SL does, to a great extent, gives you a great deal of freedom with regard to the removal of mandatory procedures and the various things. Although some people will interpret that as, oh, we've done away with procedures, we haven't. But it really needs to be down to you as individual operators to identify what you need, rather than the standard dictating that you need a procedure for this and a procedure. All they've done is remove that requirement to say where you need that procedure, you really need to look and implement it appropriately. Within your operation, it's not an add-on, it's not something to tick the box on the side of your operation, it needs to be integrated fully within your operational controls. Just an overview of where we think the systems can sit in the future. You know, 9001, the quality management system, looks at the processes, the quality and delivery based on customer satisfaction. The environmental system, the ISO 14001, looks at obviously the environmental impacts and the resource use of the planet and the interrelationship there. 45001 reinforces the 18,001 stance on people. So we've got the three core elements, and obviously there are elements of those which overlap, but essentially due to this adoption of a new standard model across all the standards, it will make the integration of these standards for businesses that adopt all three approaches far more simple and far more straightforward. When we look at occupational health and safety, I think risk assessment has got to be at the hub of the driver, the primary driver of this management system. We talked about context and the interested parties, and all these things have an influence on the system, but unless we do an effective risk management application, then we won't capture the maximum benefit of the system itself. The objectives based on the company's policy and based on the severity of risk and need of the business will come out of the risk assessment process and can be linked to that risk assessment process, as will the controls and the hierarchy of controls that we'll talk about later. And as with all these things, once we've planned it, we've implemented those controls, we need to review and reflect on, are they effective? Are they delivering the desired outcome? Can we do it any better, any differently? And there really is an emphasis on we there, because, as I said earlier, the worker participation, although we use the phrase management systems, they can only truly be effective if everyone's within the organisation is engaged in the participation of that. So we really need involvement of workers and people that are actually doing the jobs and the various things and the activities. They have an in-depth knowledge and understanding of what's going on in reality. And we want the management system to reflect that reality, not some theoretical thing that managers may adopt from a distance and think that's how that runs. Because at the end of the day, injury and ill health are fact, and that's what we're trying to reduce the risk of. So without worker participation, we are going to struggle to be effective at implementing that. This again, the hierarchy of control is re-emphasised. It's now, rather than it being part of a clause in the 18,000 version, in the 45,000 version, it now has its own standalone requirement specified within that. I won't go through it in any greater detail. You know, I think as occupational health and safety professionals will all be aware to the fundamentals and the hierarchy of control that are being applied. One of the requirements of 45,000 is one, when you're looking at the scope, is that without understanding the context and the interested party element, you can't define the scope. Because if you don't know what people's expectations are, you don't know what influence your business has on its workforce, etc., then how could you define the scope? So basically the context, the workers and the interested parties, and the strategic direction and leadership input will define the scope of the management system. So they're the three building blocks really that will define the scope. And then obviously you develop a policy, etc., down from that. If we look at the 10 elements now of the standard approach, we want to have culture change and culture improvement, performance improvement. These are the primary scope of the management system itself, the ISO itself. That is the scope of the standard. As we said earlier, section 4, the context of the organisation is basically the starting block. The external issues, the internal issues, the activities and purpose of the organisation, you need to understand, or at least have a handle on, why you do what you do, why you do it in the way you do it. Some particular industries have particular requirements on them. Are you aware of that? Are you new to that industry sector? Etc, etc. And all these things have a major impact or potential major impact on the effectiveness of the management system and the way you adopt it. I think the one thing that's worth reinforcing at this point is we talked earlier about the flexibility of the way the standard's been written. It's very much an organisation's management system. The prescriptive methodology that's been traditionally used in these things has been removed to enable you to define what you need within the context of what you want and what you need to achieve. Hence why it's very important that leadership is there regarding if there are any questions or clarity required, decision making, strategic direction, opportunities, because it isn't all about risk. There are opportunities within occupational health and safety. We may have an opportunity to improve the working environment, etc. We must consider the interested parties, both from a worker's point of view. It could also be neighbours, it could be stakeholders, i.e. owners, it could be owner management that, you know, both lead and own the business, to limit liability, to reduce culpability, etc. There'll be regulatory requirements on the business that need to be identified and controlled. The context of the organisation and the interested parties is quite a fluid thing really. Over time that may well change. The strategic direction may change. You may decide to go into a different market, a different opportunity based on commercial considerations. So when you look at context and interested parties, consider that it's almost a constant thing. It's not something that you can do and then never look at again. A lot of these activities will be done habitually within organisations. The standard just puts a formal structure in place for you to capture those interests so that you can address them and hopefully satisfy all the regulatory and other requirements that are placed upon the organisation. Leadership, as I say, it's a big step from management, which has traditionally been, well, we employ an individual to manage our occupational health and safety. So therefore, as the senior director or whatever of the organisation, I can carry on with running the business. Occupational health and safety has to be integrated fully into business decisions and business operations. You know, it can't be an add-on on the side. It will need a strategy, it will need policy, it will need roles and responsibilities, it will need participation, it will need resources, and all these things are related to leadership, not just management. Section 6, hazard identification, the planning, you know, understanding what you need to do and prioritising what you need to do based on risk and opportunity. The risk and opportunity evaluation, as I say, is fundamental to success. The more effort you put into that activity, I think the greater the benefit you will get out, because you'll have a clear path. It would be ridiculous to suggest you would spend exorbitant amount of money and resources on reducing trivial risk. You will prioritise risk, and over time what was once considered a significant risk will be brought down to an acceptable, well-managed risk. The context of the organisation can influence that, because if you take on a new opportunity both commercially, that in itself may bring about additional risks that previously weren't identified within the operations. So it's a constant dynamic approach. It's not just today we do section 4 and we move on and never look at it again. Today we do section 5, we move on. It's a management activity which needs to be integrated fully into the operation of the business. Resources, both in terms of physical, resources, the materials. We also need to look at staff resources, intellectual properties, competence, awareness, capability of staff, the environment in which they work, etc., etc. They all influence the operation and the controls required with it for that operation. Communication, essential, and that needs to be two-way. We won't get to worker participation if all it's seen is this is a management dictatum that gives us instruction and we can't feed back into it. As I said earlier, workers have a great insight into how to do the job in all probability, how to achieve the task. They need to be listened to, because at the end of the day they may have some really important and really effective methods of achieving the same thing without unnecessary burden of control. And also, they can be overly focused on the task. They can be focusing on a task, oh, we need to achieve. This is where it links to the culture. The balance between achieving the task and maintaining the protection and occupational health and safety of the workers has to be given at least equal priority. You don't want to create a culture whereby it doesn't matter how you do it, we need to produce 1,000 widgets today. What we want to do, hopefully achieve 1,000 good quality widgets safely and not compromising the occupational health of our staff and our workforce. As I say, these things are not standalone. The new phrase documented information has come in, which basically just reflects modern society. Documented information can include, IT systems, information that's in various formats. It could be displays, it could be IT systems, it can be anything, as long as it can be read and communicated. Even verbal communication can be translated into documented information. A policy statement is, to all intents and purposes, a transcript of what the senior leadership team of an organisation have said is the direction of that organisation and what they want to achieve. So it's not new technology, it's not anything that we're not used to, it's just some new terminology that's trying to encapsulate all the various media that we use now in modern society. The hierarchy of control, as we looked at briefly earlier, has now been given its own clause in the revised standard. Change management is critically important, and this is why, you know, in health and safety terms, we may look at scheduled reviews of various procedures and controls, because there may be small steps taken within various operations that aren't captured within our controls or our procedures, and unless we review what's actually going on within the workplace and within that task at a predetermined point based on risk, then potentially we get into this ivory tower where the management system thinks this is happening, and in reality something completely different is happening out there on the process area or in the sales area or wherever. So it really is quite critical that management of change, you know, most significant incidents are not just one catastrophic event. They are a result of numerous smaller, more trivial events potentially, all coming together at the same time, leading to that set of circumstances that create a catastrophic incident. And it's that attention to detail, that capturing those changes, those micro steps that we take as the process matures and develops and people's experience and competence, etc., changes over time, then that's what we're trying to capture. It can be influenced by procurement. Obviously, what we buy needs to be fit for purpose for its intended use. The way it's designed, are people trained and familiar with the equipment, etc. All these changes will need some management involvement and some leadership to be able to identify what are the potential changes, potential controls that we need to put in place, and ensure that those are effective going forward. Whenever we plan a change, an introduction of a new technology or a new process or a new activity, before introduction we should always do a risk assessment to try and identify before we start what's the implications of doing that, both in terms of competence, resource. The next one I'm going to talk about is contractors, because I think almost every organisation, certainly that I've been into in recent years, engages with contractors at some point. The communication and participation with those contractors is very, very important. Unless we've specified what we expect of that contractor and what we expect of them, so we put obligations on them and they put obligations on us. It is a two-way activity. It shouldn't just be, well, I just want somebody to come in and casually just do this. You know, have we checked the competence of the contractor? Is he fully aware of what we expect from him? Is he fully aware of how we want to work as an organisation? The controls that we put on him and his requirements. You know, he will require the system may need to be taken out of commission while he works on it, etc., etc. And all these things. It all sounds very simple, very common sense, but on a daily basis, certainly here within the UK, there are accidents and incidents involving contractors, and that's what we're trying to prevent. And obviously the next thing there is, should things go wrong, we need to have made some provision for emergency situations. Some of those could be legislative, fire precautions, etc. But it's down to us to identify the potential emergency situation based on our own activities. So it could be a system failure, it could be a release of gas, it could be whatever, based on the context of the organisation. It could be somebody else's organisation that may impact on yours. If you're located next to a nuclear power station, for example, and they have an emergency situation, I would suggest that may well or could have crucial implications on your own activity. So there again, it's about understanding the context and the interested parties regarding your organisation. It isn't just always the straightforward, the fire precautions, the spill response, the first aid. You need to look at that a little bit wider. And once we've got all those activities going on, we need to check and review and evaluate our effectiveness. Done by a great number of standard management system requirements, internal audit, management review, incident or hazard investigation, corrective actions. The one key thing I would say there is, with corrective actions, don't forget that corrective actions themselves need to be reviewed for effectiveness. The implementation of a corrective action doesn't mean you've scratched the itch or you've delivered the outcome that you need from that. So once it's been implemented, take some time to go and review the effectiveness of corrective and improvement actions to ensure that and confirm that it has actually delivered what you wanted it to. Occasionally, one corrective action can cause other issues, and this goes back to the management of change. The corrective action could change the process. You've changed the process to reduce that risk in one particular activity, but actually it's increased or changed the risk in another activity which wasn't foreseen until you actually implemented that change. So that review for effectiveness of corrective actions and changes needs to be built in. The other evaluation can be, you've set some objectives, are you meeting those objectives? And I would strongly suggest, if you've set an objective for in 12 months time, you want to achieve something, don't wait for 11 months to have gone by before you review the effectiveness. Are you on track to achieve that objective? Based on its significance and importance, look at that on an ongoing basis to ensure you're on the right track. All too often we will go in to talk to companies and businesses and various things, and they've set long-term strategic objectives, maybe 12 months, maybe 2 years. And the only real time they look at the objectives and where they are with those objectives may be an annual management review. And then they turn around and say, well, we haven't achieved our objective there, so we'll keep the same objective for next year and roll it forward. I would suggest that looks at a weakness within the leadership and management of the system, because if it wasn't delivering, you probably knew it wasn't delivering at a much earlier stage than waiting for 12 months down the line. So all these things are looking at effective management and leadership and driving improvement into the business. So we're now approaching a time whereby if you've got any questions, by all means get typing and we will endeavour to answer them at the end of the session. And if there are several questions on a particular topic, we'll try and address those. Obviously, we'll try and answer the bulk of the people the particular questions that they raise. Just to aid things along, we have done a gap analysis that is available. You can click on your screens within the webinar and there is a PDF there available to you for download. So if you need to look at that, by all means do so. It's free and available to everybody. No problem at all. And by all means circulate that to your colleagues and friends within the network. You need to click on the handouts, and it's the red PDF section within the handouts section of your control box. The timeline for migration to the new standard has been provisionally drafted by ISO. So we're looking at basically September 2016, September, October 2016 to look at the final draft, and provisional publication by early 2017. Some practical tips for those that are thinking of establishing or migrating across to the revised standard. If you're starting from scratch, have access to a copy of the standard. It sounds obvious, but the standard is written in such a way that it should answer a great deal of your questions. Identify the sources of legal compliance and information, etc. Look at the requirements that the standard puts on you and look at how you can address those currently within your organisation, see if there's any shortcomings or whatever. Review your hazard and risk assessment. Is it comprehensive? Does it look at all the various fields that you need it to look at? And if need be, do your own internal gap analysis, use our gap analysis template to help you, or get an external body in to do a gap analysis and aid that transition with you. If you've already got an existing OHSAS 18001 management system, there again, get a revised copy of the standard. Look at the gaps. There shouldn't be that many, in fairness. A great deal of 18001. The 45001 is a re-emphasis of that. There's some new terminology, but that, 2 and 2 still equal 4. And do a mapping exercise, I would suggest, for your management system to migrate across, what you're going to do and when. Have a plan. Some businesses prefer to have an end game, an end timeline, and work backwards from that. Some businesses prefer to plan forwards. Whatever suits your organisation, you know the culture of your organisation best. Be prepared for the transition. There are no surprises. The standard is in draft at the moment, but remember, the migration of certification is not possible until the final publication of the revised standard. As I say, October 2016 to January 2017. So you can't be registered against the requirements of the new standard until after the publication of the standard, regardless how prepared your organisation may be. So, the question and answer time. Right, so we've got some good questions. Yeah, we'll put them on the website, or we'll send them by email to those people who are registered as participants of the webinar. If you're interested, by all means, drop us an email. We'll send that out to you directly. So the next question, how do we differentiate here among engagement and participation? I think, in fairness, there will be supporting evidence of either and both. Engagement could be the risk assessment body within your organisation was made up of participants from the people undertaking the activity as well as management representatives or supervisors, etc. Participation could also be captured in the realms of near-miss reporting, improvements for suggestions, the minutes of meetings and consultation, various things. So there's no fixed to define engagement I need to see an X or a Y. To define engagement, depending on your organisation, could be a variety of sources of information, and it could also be borne out by, you know, the physical evidence of, there was a suggestion there from a process worker, for example, we implemented the suggestion and that's physically reduced our risk in X, Y and Z. So, you know, and I think that the thing to remember about the standard and the revision to the standard is that flexibility. So don't see the removal of the term of procedural requirements as a negative. See it as a positive, because we'll gather this evidence and this information throughout the assessment process, and you can point that out to us as we go through that within your organisation. Next question, is it true that this is a draft and there can still be changes before it is published as a final standard? Most certainly. I will refer you back to the timeline. We're not expecting the final draft to be published until September time of this year. So it's still under discussion. There's still things there that may change and probably will change. Obviously the ISO organisation does a great deal of consultation with all its member parties and interested parties within its own internal requirements to go through and iron out any anomalies regarding terminology, you know, and subtle changes can have a big difference on the way something can be interpreted. So there's a great deal of work goes on about every word within the standard, so that it doesn't, or they try to limit the misconception or the potential misconceptions of people that are reading the standard. The new scope focuses on leadership and senior management. How will or can leadership be assessed within audits? One, directly, we'll go and have a talk and a discussion with the leaders. We'll ask questions about how do you participate in this system that is the organisation system. Do they actively get involved in inspections or tours or audits or whatever? And depending on that organisation, it will be dependent on the responses there. So yes, it can be assessed. It can also be assessed in physical means. We'll look at policies, we'll look at engagement, we'll look at and go and talk to people at various levels within the organisation to reinforce that. Is it something that, you know, the senior executive have just said and made a statement and it's very, you know, talk is cheap potentially, or is that actually embodied within the organisation at grassroots level as we go around and talk to various levels within the organisation? You can get a great deal of information just by walking around and chatting to a few people, and that's how that can be assessed within audits. And then it can also be evidenced in terms of documentation and resources, etc. throughout. Internal issues, very generic term. For example, you may have a strongly unionised organisation and one of your competitors just across the road isn't strongly unionised, etc. So their requirements may be different to yours with regard to the participation and how the mechanisms are dealt with within that particular organisation. It could be an ethnicity, it could be a cultural difference between your organisation and the workers within your organisation. You know, it's a very generic statement, and this is why it can't be defined in a single way, because your organisation is unique to you and the challenges and requirements of your organisation are unique to you. So that's how I would respond to the question of internal issues. How is this review different in ISO 31000-2009? At this webinar, I'll struggle to answer that, in fairness. I've basically done a direct comparison between the existing occupational health and safety management system 18001 and not looked at it comparatively between the 31000. So in fairness, I would be struggling to answer that in any great detail. Next question is, if you're looking to implement it this year, is it best to write the system against the new standard or the old standard? In response to that, it's up to you. I can only suggest that as and when the new standard is published, it's probable that that transition period will be comparable with others, i.e. there's been a 3-year transition period for the 14,000 and the 9,000 that's have recently been revised. So I would suggest that with the introduction of 45,001, there'll be a 3-year transitional period. It depends on what the drivers are for your implementation and the context of your organisation, to coin a phrase. So it really is down to you. But as I said earlier, you will not be able to be registered against the requirements of the new standard until such time as that standard is published and released. What is my view on the role of psychosocial wellness in ISO 45001? I don't think it's any greater in 45001 than it has been in the previous version, to be fair. We're looking at well-being of the whole person. I think it's a quite common misconception that when we talk about health and safety, we're primarily concerned with accidents and injury with regard to physical injury. It's long been the case in health and safety practices that, you know, psychosocial wellness and all that comes with that, it is a more potentially difficult issue to address, and it can be more difficult to get tangible evidence of improvement. However, I think, you know, you've got to use the evidence that's in front of you. You've got to look at absentee rates, all the various things that can be linked to, you know, you would argue health and safety and human resource management. You will also get to know, you know, changes in the individual, the actual relationships between the individual. Is that, and by adopting good management practice, you may well root out some issues that you previously didn't think you had an issue with. But I think that's the same with any organisation, you know. The systems will mature over time, and therefore you'll get more and more benefit over time. Next question is, what is the main distinction between the term risk and occupational health and safety risk? Occupational health and safety risk can, as opposed to risk as a generic phrase, you know, there can be a risk that commercially the business could go out of business if it makes the wrong commercial decision. It's still a risk. It's where that can impact on the occupational health and safety of its workforce and the people engaged in that activities. I think I would quantify that in saying, if a business decided that it was going to increase its throughput by 100% in a short period of time, we're doing nothing more than telling the workers to go faster, quicker, and changing the culture of the organisation, which may have the potential to impact on the risk level within the organisation. I would say that's how the two things can be defined. So there may be a commercial opportunity that may compromise the occupational health and safety risk. All the questions that we've been highlighted to us this evening, we will share them. Also, the recording of this webinar will be available via our YouTube link, so that you can also listen to the full thing in its entirety if you were unable to engage with it on this evening or today. Sorry. Next question is, what is the prospects of ISO 20001 and its relations with health and safety and quality? I think with all these things there is a commonality. There's a direct link, because it's about business management systems. I think is the primary thing, and depending on your requirements in your drivers for 27001, it could introduce different occupational risk, or there's a lot of interrelationship there between all the standards. That was hopefully what we tried to capture within the umbrella diagram within the slides. They can't always be looked at in isolation to each other. There can be overlap, there can be interaction, there can be particular commonalities. So it's difficult to define. It depends on your individual organisation circumstance. The next question is, do I think an occupational health and safety consultancy company would benefit from having ISO 45001? I would say yes, most definitely. Certainly where it may have an existing arrangement, maybe based around 18001 or whatever, but it may well, enhance that company's commercial display of credibility by having a certified system in place. The next question is, are there plans to support the current holders of OHSAS 18001 in the migration to 45001 by NQA? There most certainly are. There's an ongoing plan with webinars such as this. We're also developing a range of training activities and training courses that will support that migration. There are also the commercial activities whereby we can do gap analysis, various things like that to aid an organisation. And we can also, and we're also looking at within our in touch to our existing clients, we're also keeping them abreast of developments, changes to the standard, changes in the legal framework, etc. And I've no doubt there'll be a whole raft of things as people get more switched on, because a lot of these things will be based on demand. If we can identify a commercial demand for that, or an internal demand within our customer base existing, then we will endeavour to provide that support. The question is, will there be an 18002 equivalent? I don't think so at this stage. It may come out later, but the 45001 is the starting point, really. You'd have to ask ISO about the development of further additions to the requirements. How does 18001 risk assessments integrate into 45001 business risk? It does quite nicely, in fairness, because the risk assessments will be based or at least partially driven by the operations and activities and the context of the organisation. And the simple principles of occupational health and safety haven't changed with the introduction of 45001. The basic principles of before you can control something, you need to risk assess and look at what the hazards are and look at the detail of each particular hazard within the activity, etc., in relation to the workforce and the capability and the skills and the competence, the working environment, the rate of work, etc. You know, the list is endless. So those things haven't really changed. I think you need to some extent, just make sure that your risk assessments are effective, and if they were effective before, there's no reason why they won't be effective going forward, but just make sure that they've been comprehensive enough and they haven't been limited in their view with regard to your operations is my advice there. Well, we're gonna finish on an up note here. I've just had some input from a webinar participant, and they're just commenting on an excellent webinar and thanking NQA and myself for the quality of materials and the delivery of the webinar. So on that high note, I'd like to thank you all for your participation, and as I say, the recording will be available via our YouTube channel, and you've got the handout that you can use from the gap analysis, and obviously we've also got, for those of you who want the slides, etc., if you email into us, we can send you out a copy of the slides and the presentation. So thank you all very much.